Music and history lessons with myself and Towns. Can I do the head thing there? Anyway, we're going to talk about music history first, then the history lesson. The Ohio-based band Prairie League, one of my favorite bands from the 70s. Their self-titled 1972 debut was recorded and released before the Eagles' debut. Both bands heavily credit to the evolution of country rock and helping propel it into the mainstream. The members were lead vocalist, guitarist Craig Fuller, guitarist George Powell, who wrote an instrumental and wrote and sang the last song. Steel guitarist John David Call, bassist Jim Lanham, and drummer Jim Collin. Could be pronounced Coughlin, though, too. They signed a 2-album deal with RCA, but after the tour of the first album, the 3 J's left, John, Jim, and Jim. They just quit the band, leaving Craig and George to fulfill the second album contract. Released 7 months after their debut, busting out, bringing in Billy Hines to play drums. Mick Ronson, who was working with, all at the same time, David Bowie, Lou Reed, Lulu, and Mott the Hoople provided string arrangements. George Powell wrote and sang another song. Michael Connor was a session musician who provided the keyboards and piano. Bassist Mike Riley joined shortly after, and then, shortly after that, ready for this one? Vocalist and songwriter Craig Fuller was sentenced to 6 months in jail for draft evasion, but don't worry, he got a full pardon. But with Craig no longer in the band and their label contract fulfilled, they hit the road. John David Call rejoined on steel guitar. Keyboardist Michael Connor joined as an official member, and Larry Garshorn joined the band as the second guitarist. So now moving over this way so I can be more comfortable. Nearly 3 years after their second album was released, a song called Amy was picked up by radio stations and hit number 27. RCA re-signed the band and they went to record their third album, Two Lane Highway, which is my favorite album by them, but I love Pure League. In 1975, Larry sang 5 songs, George sang 4 on the album, Mike sang 2 on the album. The album also featured Don Felder from the Eagles, Chet Atkins, and Emmylou Harris. In 1975, also marked Mick Ronson's second album. You remember him, he did the string arrangements for their second album. His second album, solo album, was called Play Don't Worry, which featured a Prairie League cover of Angel No. 9 from their second album, and a song called Woman that Prairie League covered on their debut, which was originally by a band called Country Funk. Before Jim Lanham was the bassist for Prairie League on their debut, he was the bassist for Country Funk. They released 2 more albums before steel guitarist John David Call left. Larry's brother Tim joined as third guitarist and fourth vocalist for their 1978 album Just Fly. How many vocalists do you need in Prairie League? In 1978, at least 4. After the album, the Garshorn brothers and George Powell left the band. Vince Gill joined, and about a year later, Prairie League signed with Casablanca Records for a couple years before the label went bankrupt, selling to Polygram Records, who then dropped the band, which led to another lineup change. There were a total of 6 lineup changes in a 9-album span. Prairie League. As of today, the Garshorn brothers and Michael Connor have passed from cancer. Prairie League is still touring. Mike Riley retired a couple years ago. John David Call is the only original known member in the band. Occasionally, though, Craig Fuller and George Powell will guest appear on stage. Prairie League. Okay, now let's talk about history. What do you say? That was music history, but now we're doing history. John Hancock. We're going to go through the signers of the Declaration of Independence again. Talk about how fate has a weird way of working. So, John Hancock was born in Braintree, Massachusetts, January 23rd, 1737, making him an Aquarius. At 17 years old, his Puritan minister father died and ultimately left the family homeless. Well, the church actually kicked out the family because they were like, we need a new ordained minister to move in. Sorry, we're doing the work of God. You have to leave. I'm sorry, you're homeless. So John was adopted by his uncle, who was too busy being a powerful Boston merchant to have kids of his own. At 23, his uncle sent him to a business trip to England, where there he attended the funeral of King George II and attended and briefly met King George III at his coronation. About 15 years later, though, King George III issued a 500-pound bounty for John Hancock's capture, rough equivalent in 1775 to $22,000. Oof. He became the heir to his uncle. When his uncle died, 27-year-old John Hancock became one of the richest men in New England. He not only enjoyed living a wealthy lifestyle, but also donated food every winter to the poor sections of Boston, helped rebuild damaged structures, commissioned artists for portraits, and frequently financed his friend Samuel Adams. We already learned about that guy Samuel. It was Adams who encouraged Hancock to go to political meetings and eventually recruiting him for the revolutionary cause. John Hancock was arrested after he told vessel crew to lock a British taxman who was inspecting one of Hancock's ships after docking in a cabin. Hancock's lawyer, future President John Adams, managed to get the charges dropped. He was one of the first to publicly propose the name United States of America while giving a speech. It was Paul Revere that sounded the alarm to alert Samuel Adams and John Hancock when British soldiers marched into Lexington to capture the pair. Hancock wanted to stay to fight the soldiers. He was finally convinced by early dawn to escape. Shortly after the war began, the British offered a pardon to all Americans who surrendered except for Adams and Hancock. Samuel Adams, that is. If the British had won, Samuel Adams and John Hancock would have likely been the first Americans executed. He was 39 when he signed the Declaration of Independence, being the first person to sign it. He had 2 children, both of whom died before reaching adulthood. He was the first elected governor of Massachusetts with 90% of the vote. He developed gout at the age of 36, which severely affected his limbs as he got older. It is stated that when new President Washington went to visit him, Hancock had to be carried out to greet the president. He died October 8, 1793, at the age of 56. Acting Governor Samuel Adams declared the day of Hancock's burial a state holiday, and it was noted his lavish funeral was the grandest given to any American up to that point. So, what did we learn about today? We learned about music history, Prairie League. Go check them out. And we learned about the founding father and also signer of Declaration of Independence, John Hancock. And do you want to see something cute? Do you want to see Towns, Resner, and Nash all laying in bed together? Look at that. They're just so cute, aren't they? I'm sure you can see them all. The babies. Oh, the babies. There's the other one. The babies.